Welcome to Investigating Cybersecurity Instance, a portion of the full Cybersecurity First Responder course from Logical Operations. My name is Stacy McBride, and I'll be your instructor for this course. The course is made up of 3 sessions, and in session number 2, we'll be looking at how to securely collect and analyze electronic evidence. In this session, we're looking at how to securely collect and analyze electronic evidence, and of course, then preserve that in a useful state so that we could use it in an investigation and possibly in a legal action. Now, when we're considering any type of digital evidence, we have to understand that pretty much all digital evidence can be volatile. In other words, it can be lost due to various factors. It could be erased, overwritten, or the media could be destroyed. And so because of this, we need to understand the nature of the evidence we're collecting and the logical order of volatility in which we would want to collect the evidence. You see, the evidence that is most at risk of loss should be collected first. So the most volatile evidence, like the contents of processor registers, processor caches, and RAM, of course, are very transient, and the content of that can very quickly and easily be overwritten, or in the case of RAM, perhaps when we remove power from the system, of course, the contents of RAM will decay. So because that is the most volatile information, and because the contents of RAM can be very critical to an investigation, we're going to want to capture that first. Now, our volatile information will provide us with useful facts, like what processes were running on the system, what network connections were open, what files were open. And today, very critical to many investigations, we may even be able to recover an encryption, decryption key from the RAM that may be used for a full disk encryption, like perhaps BitLocker or Veracrypt. And if we can recover that key from RAM, then that means that we will be able to analyze and do a forensic analysis on an image of the hard disk on the system. Whereas if the system were shut down without capturing the contents of RAM, then any possible chance of analyzing an encrypted disk will be lost, unless, of course, we can obtain the key through some other mechanism. And so capturing a snapshot of RAM is very critical. And in our previous session, we talked about some of the tools that were available. And I pointed out one from Belkasoft that is a RAM capturing tool that would be used for just that. After RAM, we would be concerned with network caches and virtual memory because, again, we have the various network connections. Those connections may have their presence and their existence recorded not just on hosts, but also on various network appliances that may be involved in the actual connection path. So we want to snapshot those as well if we can. Then we would move to more persistent types of storage, like our hard drives, USB keys, and flash drives and SSDs. So this is where a large amount of our forensic information will come from because, of course, all of the activities that are performed on a system will generally in some way impact the storage media. And so by analyzing that, we can start to put together our timeline of events and start to form a narrative that will describe who did what and seemingly why they did it, at least our opinion as to why they did it. And then the least volatile types of storage would be considered things like optical media that are not able to be easily erased. Like a hard drive, it's very easy to overwrite or erase data, whereas on our optical media, generally, most of it, you write to it once and the information is there on the media. Things like magnetic backup tapes may be considered to be somewhat less volatile as well. So in any case, we're going to try to gather our evidence in that sequence in order to try to preserve it. Now, interestingly, there are techniques today that can assist with capturing RAM, even if we're unable to log on to the system in order to capture that RAM. Because, of course, normally to run a RAM capturing tool, we've got to have access to the system. Today, there is a couple of different approaches. One makes use of a FireWire connection, where through a FireWire port, we can capture an image of memory on a system that is not logged in. And another approach is something that was created by researchers at Princeton University. It's referred to as a cold boot attack, and it was designed to recover the encryption keys from RAM so that we could decrypt encrypted drives. And the cold boot attack basically involves freezing the memory chips, cooling them down to about minus 50 degrees Celsius, and keeping them cold. Then we can shut the system down, and the actual contents of RAM, when it's that cold, doesn't decay. And that means that we can then take those chips, we can put them in an imaging station, create an image of the content of the RAM chips, and in this way capture the contents of RAM even if we don't have the ability to log onto the system. And of course, in those scenarios, it's even more important because now there would be no other way of determining the running processes, open network connections, open files, and decryption keys that would be necessary for the investigation. So lots of neat developments in that regard. And of course, there are many different tools that can assist and automate our collection of volatile information. Many of these will have batch files or scripts that will run that will go through a number of different items and capture them. Of course, one of the key things that we're going to be capturing when we do that volatile analysis would be the current time that is recorded on that system. And we're going to, of course, remember to record the offset of that current time on the system from an accurate time source so that we can then normalize the timestamps on all of our log entries. A lot of our forensic efforts will be involved in analyzing file systems. And of course, in the file system, we have the files, and the contents of the files are often very informative. And so, of course, we're interested in that. But even more than the content of the files, the metadata about the files can equally be useful. So as we examine a file system, we can view the directory structure. And you might think, well, so you see the directory structure, so what? Well, the thing is, if someone has intentionally attempted to collect and or hide certain types of information, they may have created directories in an attempt to move those files off out of the way, as it were. And so if we find that there are actually directories or folders created in the directory structure that contain certain files, that starts to demonstrate the fact that the individual probably had intent to do so, and they took a purposeful action in creating that folder and then storing those files there. So that can be interesting. So the actual location of the files can sometimes give us clues as to whether this is some kind of accidental event or whether it is in fact something purposeful. We also are going to look at things like file sizes. Now, the file sizes might tip us off to the fact that maybe a file that appears like it doesn't contain very much actually has a lot of empty space at the end of it that might be used to hide information through various steganographic techniques. It might indicate that a file has been modified. File names and the naming and structure of those names can often be a red flag as well. For an example, if a perpetrator has taken a number of image files or video files and renamed them as .txt files or something like that, now the file extension does not match the actual content of the file or the file header. And many of our forensic tools will scan for those mismatches and identify them so that we can be alerted to the fact that someone is trying to hide the true nature of a file from the investigator. And of course, the first portion of the file name is also useful because sometimes files are named in such a way that it will indicate what the person was doing, or those file names might be used to show that a particular file was copied from maybe a server, and now we find that same file on another person's machine or on a USB key, and that can link that person with the activity of maybe exfiltrating that data. Now, of course, in our scenario that we discussed in session number 1, that we're going to continue discussing, we remember that there was an individual that we believe may have been involved in exfiltration of data named Rupert. We have identified some files on a USB key that were stolen from a server, and of course, that there were other files on that key that were found in Rupert's home directory. So based on that correspondence between the existence of the files in the server and on the USB key, we can now start to tie that together and possibly identify who the perpetrator is. The date and time values on the file are very important, and we mentioned this in our earlier session as well. We talked about the MAC times, and we know that the MAC time stands for the modified, accessed, and created timestamps, and these timestamps will give us clues as to the sequence of events that have occurred on a system. Now, we can't take them as absolute truth because, of course, they can be modified, and we do need to understand that various different operating systems record these in different ways. And even during our investigation, we need to understand how the tools that we use might impact or affect those MAC times. And so we have to take that into account during our investigation. And then, of course, there's other attributes of files. If a file is flagged as a hidden file, that might be a clue as to the fact that, again, it's being intentionally tried to be obscured. When we are going to perform forensic analysis of a system, we often will capture a system image of the storage media. And of course, those system images are going to be validated to prove that they are identical to the original through a hashing process. And you'll see that in our first activity that's coming up in this lesson, where we'll actually create a forensic image of a USB drive. Now, using those system images, we can analyze them with various forensic tools, and those forensic tools will then allow us to view and analyze the metadata associated with the files, and then, of course, include the evidence that we collect from that in our investigation. It's very important that as a forensic investigator that we be aware of the different file system types because they all behave somewhat differently. And as we're performing an investigation, we should be sure that we are very familiar with the file system type that we're working with and have proper training on it so that we, again, understand how it makes use of timestamps, how it erases files, how files are and file clusters are allocated within the file system as well. When you're analyzing a file system, of course, the files that are visible in the file system can easily be analyzed, but often we'll find that many times the file systems that we're analyzing will have deleted files, perhaps deleted partitions, or even fragments of files that may be able to be recovered from other areas of the disk. Now, these types of file fragments that are no longer associated with the file system, that have no actual metadata associated with them, can be located through a process called file carving. With file carving, we have a program that will scan the surface of the disk image, looking for specific sequences of bytes that represent the file headers that identify certain types of files. You see, on our systems, even though Windows systems might use an extension to identify a type of file, internally in the file, there's actually a file header that clearly identifies whether that file is a JPEG file or a text file and so on. And so because of that internal information, we can search for and find these file fragments, find the various clusters that make up the particular file and reassemble them back into a useful file so that we can then analyze that as well. You'll find that in the LO choice platform, if you click on the Learn To tile, there's actually a short little video there on recover deleted data. And so you can learn to do that using the techniques that are shown there. Now, of course, many malicious users are going to try to cover their tracks and hide what they've done. And so we would expect that a lot of our evidence would be recovered from things like deleted files or files that have been renamed or obscured in some way. Some of the tools that might be used to perform these recovery activities might include a tool like Test Disk, which is used to recover deleted files and deleted partitions, or Foremost, which is used as a data carving tool to search for and carve out all of the files of specific types that may exist on a file system. The same outfit that makes Test Disk also has a tool called PhotoRec, and PhotoRec is a easier to use tool for carving out images and other file types from a system, but Foremost is a little more powerful, more configurable, and may be able to find things that PhotoRec might miss. But the point is there are many different tools available, and all of these are open source, freely available tools. We understand that while some of our data is volatile and it could easily be damaged or lost, other data that we may use is quite persistent and is likely to not go away when the power goes off. And so because of this, we're going to, of course, analyze the persistent data after we've collected and captured our volatile information. Now, when we go to collect this, we understand that to collect the persistent data, one of the most common methods is to create a disk image. And of course, in order to do that, to create that disk image, we normally would have to shut the system down and then create the image using an external operating system that would copy the contents of the disk to an image file, and then of course generate hash values to prove that those copies are absolutely identical to the originals. Now, the thing is, we may also do some type of live analysis on a system where we're looking at what's happened on a system. And of course, understand that as you're looking through evidence on a live active system, if you're using, let's say, you see a document that looks suspicious, and you go to open up that document file, maybe using Microsoft Word, Microsoft Word is going to update the timestamps on the file and the metadata surrounding the file, and that information will be lost if you haven't already captured it. And so we have to understand that we can damage evidence if we work on the actual live system. So we have to make sure that either the tools we use are not going to make those changes, or that we instead work off of a forensic image so that we can always go back to the original and create another image if we've made a mess of the investigation. As we examine the files, we can use tools like the one we're going to use in our activity, which is part of the sleuth kit. It's called Autopsy. It's a web-based front end that allows us to do a bit of an investigation of an image that we've captured. The most common way to capture that persistent data, as I said, is to create the disk image. And of course, we have to validate that by hashing. And we're going to demonstrate that in our first activity that we'll be doing very soon, using a command line Linux command to create that image and also create the hash value for it. We need to make sure that we have the ability to preserve and store and maintain the data related to our cases. When we gather evidence for a case, we may need to preserve that evidence and make it available and protect it for months or even many years. And so that means that we have to have adequate storage capacity for storing the images. We also have to have a secure way of storing those so that we can maintain the chain of custody for the evidence. So we want an evidence locker. We may actually have a safe inside the evidence locker. We're going to have our chain of custody forms. For items that maybe we're not going to put in a locker, we may use evidence bags that are tamper evident. So in other words, we can put a device inside of a evidence bag, seal it, and sign it. And if the bag is opened, the fact that it's been opened can be identified because of the nature of the bag. So we need mechanisms in place to ensure the authenticity and the integrity of the evidence so that that can't be challenged in court. And so our storage rooms need to be properly monitored, perhaps using CCTV systems, and of course having as many possible controls in place to be able to prove the integrity of the evidence that may be used in a case. We also want to think about the potential for damage to the evidence if it's stored in a way where it could be subjected to high humidity, heat, or water. And so we want to ensure that, again, our evidence locker is protected from those types of events that could impact the quality of the evidence. When we go to analyze a system that we believe has been compromised, there are a number of different procedures that we may follow. Now, often our investigation after capturing our volatile information may start out with capturing a forensic image of the system. This is a bit-for-bit copy, sector-by-sector copy. We're not doing the copy at the file system level. We're doing it at the sector level where we're creating an identical version of that disk, including all of the bytes that are on the surface that may have been deleted, represent deleted files, or the remnants of files that are left over inside of the slack space at the end of a cluster or at the end of a partition. And so we're capturing an identical copy and proving it's identical by hashing that. Then we may also want to examine network traffic and logs. There's many sources for these log files, like our intrusion detection systems, our firewalls, our routers, servers, our desktop computers, and so on. And we want to look at all of these different potential sources of logs because they could all yield evidence related to the particular incident we're investigating. If we do have internal CCTV cameras that monitor our space, we can then visually tie an individual's presence at the keyboard of a system, perhaps, to events that are recorded in the log. So that's one use of video. But also, there may be video that may actually become evidence that is being captured from within the system that we're analyzing. And so we may need to scrutinize videos for clues related to the particular case. We always need to make sure that we've recorded the time offset for the clock on the system under investigation with reference to an accurate time source. And of course, we're going to use hashing to prove that not only our original image is identical to the or our forensic copy is identical to the original, but also that every single file on the disk that we work with is the original file as well. So we often will run through and generate hash values on all of the individual files on the system. We may take screenshots of every step of our work. So as we're doing the investigation, we may use a utility to take a screenshot so that we can document everything that was done in a very clear way. So again, none of our procedures can be called into question. We also want to take photographs of the overall physical crime scene so that we can keep track of things like where devices were in relationship to the system, were they connected, and if they were connected, exactly which ports were each peripheral device connected to. So we'll photograph and label all of the cables, all of the interfaces, and everything that is associated with the actual physical crime scene. We may want to also identify any witnesses that could provide evidence as to what went on with the particular incident. And so if there's anyone who observed what went on, their testimony may be helpful in establishing the veracity or accuracy and the authenticity, I should say, of the evidence that may have been collected as well. And it's important that we do track our man hours and expense for these investigations because with the proliferation of mobile devices, laptop computers, and other containers of evidence today, a single case may not just involve analyzing one workstation's hard drive. So this may mean that these cases take a lot of hours. And of course, there's a cost associated with that. There's a cost associated with the storage media that will be required to preserve the images. And so we need to take that into account and ensure that the organization is going to receive some type of benefit from the actual investigation that justifies its overall cost. Again, there's another Learn To video that you can view called Capture a System Image for Forensic Analysis that is in the logical choice system. So go and check that out and you'll be able to see how we can do that. I want to refresh your memory with respect to the incident that we're investigating. As you'll recall, an attacker tried to access Charles' account remotely, but was unable to do so, but later on was able to gain entrance to the office and was able to find a password that was written down at Linda's workstation. Using that password, the attacker gained access to the research and development server and copied a smartwatch schematic to Linda's workstation, and then copied the file to a USB key and deleted the file from Linda's workstation. And so this is the breach that we're investigating right now. This, of course, leads us to activity 11-2 and 11-3 for this particular lesson. And in the first activity, we're going to look at how we can securely collect electronic evidence. And the way that we're going to be doing that is by using a command line utility in Linux that will create a forensic image of the USB key that is being considered here. And it will also create the hash value of that key automatically so that we can use that in our investigation. Then, in activity 11-3, we're going to look at analyzing forensic evidence, and we're going to use autopsy to analyze the image that we've captured. So let's have a look at how we would capture that image here in Kali Linux. So first of all, I want to create a directory to contain the image file that I'm going to be creating. I'll just call this image files. And now that I've created that directory, I'm going to use the command dcfldd. Now this is just like the dd command in Linux, data dump command if you would, but this is a command that not only does the data dump, but it also is going to generate the hash values for us automatically. It uses the same syntax basically as our dd command, and so I'm specifying the device that I want to create the image of, and then it's going to specify the output file, and the output file is going to write the output to, of course, the directory that I just created, which was root/image_files, and I'm going to name the output file USB image.dd. I want to set my hash value to be created as an MD5 hash, which is not very strong, but for our demonstration purposes it will do. And I'm going to set my block size to 512 bytes per block. So I hit enter, and you can see now that I have created this new image file. And if I do a directory listing here, you can see I have my image files directory. I change into image files and do a listing, and we have this new USB image.dd file. So that is how we can capture the forensic image. Now, of course, you'll note that the MD5 value that was calculated on the original drive is shown here, and I'm going to copy that into my paste buffer because I'm going to need that later when I use autopsy to verify the integrity of the image file. In this lesson, there's a couple of questions that we're to consider. One is, why is it important to take note of the hash value of the drive image? And of course, the reason for that hash value is to support integrity, to be able to prove that the forensic image we've captured is identical to the original drive. Also, we're asked what kinds of important metadata are collected in a disk image. And so, of course, we're capturing the entire image of the disk, which is going to include the directory structure, file names, file sizes, creation and modified and access dates and times, and so on. And finally, what preservation techniques should we use to ensure that we don't lose our evidence that we've collected? And of course, it's recommended that we have some redundancy here. So it would be a good idea to have more than one replica or copy of the image so that if one piece of media were to fail or to become corrupted, we would have another piece for a fallback position. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at activity 11-3, where we're going to examine this evidence. Now, in this case, the scenario here says that now that you've securely collected evidence from Rupert's USB drive, you can begin the process of analyzing the evidence to determine who really is responsible for the incident, why they did it, and how. Being able to answer these questions will not only help you piece together what happened, but will be extremely valuable in the event that DevLTech decides to press charges. And so what we're going to do now is I want to start up autopsy. And when we run autopsy, what happens is it actually starts up a server that listens on port 9999, and then we use a web browser to connect to that port. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm just going to open a link, the link that's on that page that will take me through to my autopsy browser. Now that I'm in the autopsy browser, I want to create a new case. And this new case that I'm going to investigate, I will call the Rupert case, because that's the name of the person that we suspect that is the perpetrator in this situation. And this is possible industrial espionage. There we go. And the investigator name in this case, of course, is my name. And I will create the new case. I want to add a host into this case. And the host I'm going to be adding is going to be a USB drive. So I'll just call it USB_drive. So that's going to be the name of the device that I'm imaging, basically. And the description of that drive is going to be a captured USB drive. Okay. I'm not going to record any time zone offset or skew adjustments. I don't have that information here. But you'll also notice that something that autopsy will accept is a path of an alert and an ignore hash database. Now, the reason this is very useful is that sometimes there are certain files that always mean something significant. For example, law enforcement has a list of hash values that are the hash values associated with known images of child pornography. And so if they're working a case, they don't have to search for and look for those pictures necessarily. They can simply search for files that match those hash values that are in that database. And if they find a file that matches the hash, they know that it is one of those known images. So that would be an alert hash database. An ignore hash database would be used to remove common files that are on every system that we don't need to consider at all because they are known good files. So things like operating system files could fall into this category so that we can get them out of the way, and that way we're not wading through a lot of standard files, but now we're looking at the unique files that make up the case. So I don't have a database of either of those, so I'll just add my hash in, or my host in. And now I want to add the image into this case. So I would select the image file that I want to add. And the image file that I'm going to be inserting here is going to be coming from the root directory, /root, which is my home directory, under the directory called image_files. And then the file, I believe, is called USB image.dd. Okay, now this is going to be a disk symbolic link. Okay, we're going to use those settings, and we want to select that this is a volume image. So it's because it's USB key, it's not a disk, it's a volume image, and that the volume system type we will say is a DOS image. So we click OK to that. Now at this point, we're going to want to verify our hash value. And this is where we're going to prove that this file is that we're going to be analyzing is identical to the original image. So the hash value that I captured or put in my paste buffer before I began, when I created my disk image, can be pasted in here now, and autopsy will verify that the image file that's been created matches that hash value. Once we've got that, I can click Add, and it says that it's testing the partitions and the image file has been added. I click OK, and now we have our file that has been loaded into our case. Now the next step in considering the case is we're going to want to look at the image integrity just to make sure that our image was good. So I'll click on image integrity and I'll calculate the image integrity, and you can see down at the bottom there it shows the same MD5 file that or value that we used previously. And so you can see that, yeah, we have the same value as was identified when we created the image. So that's one step that we'd want to follow. Now, the next thing we might want to do is go in to actually analyze the image. You'll note that there are a lot of other things that we can do here. We can update our hash databases for those include and exclude databases, and we can build file activity timelines as well, so that we can put together that narrative of events. But what we're going to do is just go in to do an analysis. And so to start the analysis of the system, we're going to choose File Analysis. And this gives us a browser that allows us to view the contents of that image file. Now you notice that we can generate an MD5 list of files. If we do that, it's going to create an MD5 value for each of the files in the current directory. And of course, as we do that and save those, this gives us a way of proving that the files that we're using are, in fact, the identical files to the ones that were captured. Now, as we drill down through here, you'll see that for each entry, we have some directory entries. We also, over on the right-hand side, have metadata associated with some of these entries. So you can see the Ds represent directories. So we've got a directory here called dtwatch. We've also got other files that are in the main directory. So funstuff.doc, if I click on that, you can see it shows me the content of that file down below. And I could, it says that this is a Microsoft Word 2007 file. It recognizes it. But so I could export that file and then open it up with Word to actually view the contents with a Word viewer. Or if I were to scroll down a little bit here and choose maybe a file that is a graphic file, we'd be able to view it. But let's drill down to the DT watch folder, because we're working this case, we're looking for something about this stolen watch schematic, and so this DT watch folder seems suspicious. So as we drill down, we can see that within this directory, there are a number of different files. We've got a spreadsheet, we've got a JPEG file here, and if I click on that, we can see that if we click on View File Full Size, it's got wearable features related to perhaps a smartwatch. Okay, so that might be evidence that could be involved in the case. And so, of course, we could, again, export that file out or add a note so that we are going to note that that might be an important file. And as we go down here, we will identify that there is a smartwatch.png. Okay, so if I click on that, you can see that this file also has metadata over on the right-hand side. If I click on that metadata, it describes the name of the file, the hash value that represents that, and you can see other factors related to the file created and modified timestamps, which in this case we only have the create timestamp because of the nature of the file system that was used. And we can view the contents from here or export the contents as well. And this looks like a kind of a block level schematic of our smartwatch. And perhaps this may be the file that we're looking for that was stolen from our systems. So if I go back to the case now and go back up to the file analysis again, we can drill down on other factors. So for an example, if there are any deleted files in this image, we can click on all deleted files and it will give us a list of any files that are seen to be deleted. That can be very useful in identifying things that have been removed. Now in this case, because of the nature of the image, there aren't any deleted files. We also may have an orphan files directory, and if you click on that orphan files directory, that also might give us evidence of any files that perhaps were deleted or disconnected from the directory. Now, this tool is not providing us with any data carving. It's not finding fragments of files, but it is giving us some specifics of at least the file system that we can see within the image. Using this tool, we can do keyword searches. We can also do things like look at file types and sort our files by type. And when you do this, it will do things like generate a list of the different types of files, and notice extension mismatches. So if you've got extension mismatches, that's typically a red flag that somebody's renamed the file extension on a particular system. And if you wanted to actually view those files that are output, then what we have to do is open up this URL that's generated in another tab. For whatever reason, they don't link that one. And now you've got these links that will allow you to link through to the different image types. And so it gives you the information on which of these and which inodes on the system are storing those particular files, and other information about the files. Like these JPEG files often will contain EXIF information, which identifies, for instance, the type of camera that was used to take the picture, and so on. So we've got a lot of different details that can be extracted using these types of tools. And we can look at the metadata associated with the data that's stored on the system as well. So using Autopsy, we're able to identify files of interest, export them out, record documentation related to them, so that, again, we can build our case and put together our timeline. So for an example, we have the event sequencer that allows us to add in specific events into the case and then insert them into the timeline so that we can describe what has happened on the system. So with that, we've had a bit of a quick look at Autopsy, and we do have a couple of questions that we want to consider here. First of all, how can this tool help us in our case against Rupert? Well, of course, it allows us to analyze the content of the disk image without damaging or contaminating the original evidence drive. Autopsy can also allow us to display the file names that are in that DTWatch folder that we saw. And of course, the fact that many of the file names in that DTWatch folder match the files that are on the server that represent the files that were in the same directory as the files that were stolen, then this may give us some indication that the drive we're examining does in fact contain a copy of files from the file server. And so the evidence here is pointing to the fact that, yes, probably Rupert did actually copy the files, because of course we were able to obtain this drive from Rupert. Now, the last question says that we've also interviewed some of Rupert's co-workers, and those co-workers reveal that Rupert appeared frustrated at his job, thought he was underpaid and treated poorly, and they heard that he was offered a job by a competitor. So that testimony obviously would add to the evidence of the case, providing now motivation for Rupert, and it can be seen that Rupert's intentions likely were to sell or give away the secrets related to this smartwatch, perhaps to the competitor, and in that way maybe secure their position with the new company. Okay, so that's the evidence that we've considered, and as you can see, through these tools, we're able to get a more detailed view of what goes on there. So what do we do next? Well, your next steps would be perhaps to look deeper into the Cybersecurity First Responder certification and find out why that certification is relevant, how you can obtain training that will help you to achieve the certification, and how to actually take the certification exam. All that information is available from Logical Operations using the information on this slide. And by all means, go and check out their website, get more details on Cybersecurity First Responder, and look into perhaps taking the full Cybersecurity First Responder class. When you're ready, of course, you can take the exam, and the exam vouchers are available through the tinyURL that is also shown on the slide. So I hope you've enjoyed this second of 3 sessions, and that you'll come back and join me for the final session in this Investigating Cybersecurity Incidents course.